Welcome back, everybody, to the monthly AVH study group webinars. We really appreciate your coming. Tonight, we're going to do the format just like a regular study group. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. And as long as your audio is okay, then I would like to keep you unmuted for the session. So let's see what's going on here. Okay, so it looks like most people here are either recent PIVH graduates or new AVH signups. Jane, let me just switch this over so we don't have to. Oops, we don't have to, sorry about that. There we go. So, Jane, what I just said is that we're going to do this session pretty much format-wise like a regular study group. So it's going to be an open discussion. All the mics are open. So anyone, including yourself or Henrietta or anyone else here, can just either raise their hand, type something in, or speak. So can everyone hear me? Jean, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Ela, can you hear me?
Yes.
And am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, correctly. Yes, it's correct.
Okay, how about Keelan? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Can you hear me? Rachel, we're not hearing you. So we'll keep you unmuted because it's quiet there, and if you have any questions and you're not able to say them, then just type them. Stephanie, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. And Vanny, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. So why don't we start out, by saying how, it's interesting because we were just having this discussion the other day that after 20 some odd years of homeopathy, integrative homeopathy practice, I feel like I'm just starting to really, get this homeopathy thing as far as being able to, accurately and easily help all of my patients. So, how do you guys feel? How do any newbies feel as far as the process?
Well, I'm not a newbie, but I could share. I was practicing homeopathy for 15 years when I really became fearless about it and about not doing what they taught me in vet school. I wasn't doing anything to cover my butt about it or anything like that anymore. And now it's 30 years. And just today, I was thinking, at the end of the day, I was thinking about how much I enjoy being a homeopath. And because now, yeah, it's getting easier and you to get the results without having to work as hard at it because, I know the remedies better.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's never boring. And today, for example, I had been treating this dog for diarrhea that he suddenly had. And I hadn't seen him in person for over a year. And I told the lady that I really should examine him, and she couldn't bring him in because he's too big or whatever. So we did a house call. And she told me that the diarrhea, because I hadn't talked to her since last week when I went over there today, and I had told her to give him phosphorus, hoping that would do something because the previous remedy did not. And she said she gave him the phosphorus, and the next morning, or during the night, she got up for some other reason, and she found that he had vomited this enormous cat.
Okay, Rachel. Sorry about that, Jane. He had vomited this enormous what?
Cat toy, a
Ah,
giraffe.
oh,
And it's like, the phosphorus just kicked it out. And he'd been sick for a couple of weeks, And it was
wow.
just kind of funny and fun, too. It was just pretty
Yeah,
great.
that's awesome.
So,
You saved her major surgery.
yeah, well, and she couldn't get him anywhere. She just wasn't going to put him in the car. He's probably 120 pounds. He's a big fat lab.
Big boy, wow.
Yeah.
So, anybody else have any cases or any miracle seeming to be miracle cures or treatments that you've seen in the past couple of weeks? Dr. Beal, anything that you've seen in the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, quite a. I'm just trying to think. I've had some really nice sheep cases from a lady who bought a flock of. She didn't even know what she bought. They were mostly running gear and a little bit of hide, and they were all bred and trying to have babies in the middle of Iowa in the blizzards. And she's a homeopathic study group lady who didn't really know so much about homeopathy and tended to give remedies for every little thing and not really understand what was happening. And she's done some really nice work in the last month, and has lambed all these ewes and had 2 dead lambs out of everything, which is pretty amazing actually considering. And all the mamas are good, and she's using less remedy than she used to and is much clearer about stuff. It's been quite interesting.
And Dr. Beal, did you have any others? Because I believe you had said you have some specific topics or
Yeah,
topic for tonight. Yep.
yeah, I actually put together some material about poultry, because over the last, well, certainly last year and even the year before, we had some discussion about treating poultry. And I know, I'll fully declare my bias here. I'm the vice president of the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association, which is actually an international organization, not just because I'm in Canada and the members are in the States, um, but we just finished our annual meeting in Texas in late January. We had expected that we were going to get maybe 100. We had 150 or 160 people registered, and we ended up with, something over 200 people out there. Um,
Wow.
and and what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of people out there who are, I mean, there's a lot of backyard chicken people out there, certainly, but the people that are raising pastured poultry for profit are also looking for some guidance. And certainly, just because of the bias of our organization and the bias of the board and the people who are, contributing fairly a lot to the group, we have a pretty interesting listserv that's pretty active and that sort of stuff. What the tendency is to treat with natural remedies. So a lot of the advisors and folks that have been in the business for a long time, that's our bent. Anyway, so I put together some slides. I put together some slides about pasture poultry and just some there's some basic stuff at the beginning, and there's some medicinal kinds of stuff at the end. And the presentation isn't set up specifically to be a homeopathy presentation, because, as is the case so often with the stuff that we're called to treat in production animals, is certainly we're called to treat stuff, but really the foundational reason why we're called to treat stuff is because there's errors in um, in management or feed or housing or some sort of husbandry. And unless we're really aware of what's going on with that, we're going to be putting out fires, but not solving any problems. The other thing that's really interesting is that, when we look at the expected lifespan of a broiler, those birds go from hatching to the Cornish cross birds, go from hatching to slaughter in 5 to 7 weeks in a well-run flock. Some of the other types of birds would maybe go 7 to 9 weeks, and the heritage birds would go into maybe 9 to 11 weeks or so for the heritage broilers. Same so with layers. We're called to treat a lot of stuff in layers that is happening when they're out there laying eggs. After there's 6, 7, 8, 10 months of age. We'll see, we'll get called in their first and second lay, but really the stuff that we end up treating there can often go back to what happened to them when they were peeps and pullets, and how they were fed out, and what kind of diet and stuff they had there. And so it doesn't matter how much remedy you put in the bucket, or how much of anything else that you put up in the bucket, if that foundational stuff isn't there, we don't, we see some issues. I'm going to put this on slideshow so that you guys can see the slideshow more clearly than all the other nonsense on the background of the screen. The trouble when that happens is I can't see the control panel, Jeff. So if anybody has hands up or questions or comments or anything, you're gonna have to relay them to me. I'm gonna go through some basic stuff. I'm gonna show you a whole bunch of pretty pictures and make some commentary to them. And then the latter part of stuff, I've actually got some disease kinds of things. So I'm gonna just jump in, and away we're gonna go.
And Sue, if you hit escape when you're in your slideshow, that should allow
Yeah, it
you
flips
to
it back and forth, like
or-
just happened there, which is kind of
yeah,
tough on everybody's eyes, I think.
yeah.
Um,
Weird, yeah.
so just jumping in, for those of you who don't know, this is a turkey poult. He doesn't have his beak clipped. A lot of those turkeys and other birds come out of the hatcheries, and they nip the end of their beaks off in the first part of life. Most folks raising pastured birds prefer not to do that. So the most important and influential factors that we see when we're talking about troubleshooting nutrition and management things, movement is a really primary thing that differentiates the pasture poultry producers from the other groups and factions of poultry producers. And these birds move across the land. They either move across, and they move across pastured land, something that's covered ideally. But I've got some slides to show some management things that influence that. So movement is the first and foremost thing that differentiates the pastured guys from the non-pastured guys. The biggest influential factors in raising actually any kind of animal or livestock is the air quality first, the water quality second, and the feed quality third. We spend a lot of time talking about feed quality, and we forget about water. And depending on who you read, for every pound of dry matter an animal eats, they eat 3 to 7 pounds of water. And I see lots and lots of stuff. And anybody who's heard me talk about anything, I go back and talk about how important water is. And we can live longer with water than we can without food, than we can without water. And we certainly can't live very long without air. And that's one of the things, a lot of the things that I see in pastured birds and confinement birds as well are related to air quality. I have no idea why that's doing this. So ideally, the air needs to be exchanged 4 to 6 times a day. We can sometimes do that with the setup of our coop and our house, and I'll show you some photographs that'll show you why that is. Sometimes we have to use fans. Again, I have no idea why it's doing this. Drafts, you don't want drafts, and you don't want air flowing in at the ground level, and there shouldn't be any breezes at the birdie level. And sometimes people have to get down there and actually see what's going on at the level of the bird. Poultry's threshold for ammonia, when they start having damage to it, is at the time way under when humans can smell it. I say virgin noses here. A human who hasn't worked in livestock and hasn't spent time around livestock and certainly hasn't spent time in confinement barns or hog barns and stuff, they can pretty much smell 25 parts per million ammonia. And anybody who's worked in the industry, a lot of times their noses get totally burnt out and they can't even smell that. That's sort of on the low end when it just starts to smell ammonia-y. We see in poultry at less than 10 parts per million that there's permanent damage to the respiratory tract in these birds. And we also see in all species at around 1 to 2 parts per million, we actually see immunosuppressive stuff happening from the ammonia. And again, it's really important. It doesn't do very much for me at 5'9", 5'10" to walk into an environment and start to make comments. If I can smell it up where my nose is, which is probably at about 5'6", imagine what those birds on the floor or on the ground are smelling. We see excess humidity in confined spaces. It can actually cause respiratory symptoms and it can exacerbate existing respiratory symptoms. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get called to a situation where we're having birds having respiratory distress, whether they're breathing quickly, whether they're snicking, whether they actually have some snotting and sneezing and sinus things and air saculitis things and that sort of stuff going on. We can give all the remedy in the world. Sometimes all we really have to do is increase the air exchanges and get the humidity back to where it belongs. We see humidity. It's a real problem in the winter. It's a real problem in some places where we've got heat and humidity. So some of the southern parts of the country, some of the northern parts of the country seasonally as well. And so the art here is getting that balance of fresh air, frequent air exchanges, and reasonable humidity in the area where these birds are. This is a client, a friend of mine, actually. She raises birds in British Columbia, and these birds look a little bit muddy. These are Cornish crosses, pretty ready to slaughter, actually. But you can see that she's got this mister because it gets so hot in those areas that she needs to mist these birds to keep them cool. A lot of these birds don't have a lot of ability to dissipate heat, and that can be problematic. The other thing I'm reminded is that we look at these kind of hoop houses, and I'll show you a bunch of pictures of them a little bit as we go. One of the things that we need to remember is that poultry, chickens in particular, are jungle birds. They like to be in the shade. They like to be in low light. They get freaked out in excessive light. They want to lay their eggs in the darkest place that they can. For the laying birds, the meat birds want to be in a dark place, and there sometimes we'll see issues with cannibalism with high light. It's especially a problem in the wintertime when we get snow reflecting off with these white-sided houses, or houses that people think, oh my gosh, they shouldn't be in the dark, they need to have windows, blah blah blah. And it gets really problematic. A lot of the times we'll put reflective tarps on, we'll put shade cloth over the top of these hoops, or we'll actually put darker canvas or plastic over the top of these hoops. I've been in places where folks have cobbled together, what they're going to use for covering, and they might have a white covering, a blue covering, and a green covering. A lot of times the birds will prefer to stand under the green covering. Here we go with the water quality thing. Again, I have no idea why it's doing that. We want to have birds not drinking out of puddles. We don't want them drinking out of ponds. We want to make sure that we've got a clean water supply. We want to make sure that that water supply is consistent. If you knock off water to a laying hen, even for an hour, 2 hours, that bird is immediately going to forget how to lay eggs, and she is going to stay out of laying eggs for about 21 days before she gets back. There's not very many reasons for birds to quit laying eggs overnight, but or like suddenly like that whole bunch. But having no water is one of the things. Watering devices, it doesn't matter how fresh the water is if they're going into crappy stuff. One of the things that we see a lot in pastured birds that we don't tend to see as much in confinement birds is if they're running water across out in the pastures, and the pipe, the pipe or the hose gets hot, if it's not in the shade or not buried, that water can come out of that water at literally at 130, 150 plus degrees. And I've seen birds come up, take a drink, leap back from the drinker and fall over dead because the water's too hot. These guys run about 105 degrees, so we certainly want to make sure that the water is no hotter than body temperature. And for mature birds, actually, the sweet spot for them is between 70 and 80 degrees. When we talk about in the shade, certainly the water supply lines and that sort of stuff, put them on the fence lines, put them somewhere where there's some forage growing up all over them. But actually, the birds will drink more and use the water more appropriately if it's in the shaded areas. They're not going to wander out into the sunshine to get a drink. They just don't do it. And I really recommend that folks test their water regularly. If you know anything about water testing, you know that you can get an agricultural water testing versus potable water testing. And egg water doesn't do any bacteria testing at all. And I frequently troubleshoot places where we've got really, really high bacterial loads in the water, and it doesn't help if you're drinking water that's got 200 colony forming units per milliliter of E. coli, 200 colony forming units of E. coli per milliliter of water. You're behind the 8 ball with that group of animals. And I had one like that actually last week. They had really high E. coli and they had really high sulfates. Feed, again, the feed quality is really, really important. Freshness makes a huge difference. We see that 14 days of processing is kind of the optimal space. Great difference in feed conversion and whether they'll eat it and won't eat it. If it's over than 30 days old, you're about wasting your time to feed it. And we'll see, 30 to 50+% decrease in feed conversion. When we send that old feed out to test, it bears no resemblance to the label. And it's really problematic if you're, saving feed from one batch of peeps to the next batch of peeps. It's really problematic if you're buying bag feed in the stores, that sort of stuff. And again, we need to feed the birds. It sounds so silly to say, but it's one of the biggest mistakes that I see, folks. They'll feed finishing food to a peep. They'll feed a laying ration to a young laying hen, a pullet before she's started to lay eggs, or just as she's starting. And if you feed a laying ration to a growing up bird that's getting ready to lay eggs, the calcium balance is wrong for them. It actually calcifies their kidneys, and it makes it so that they won't lay. They certainly won't meet their genetic potential for the type of bird that they are. The molds and toxins, again, anybody who hears me talk about this stuff, I talk about it a lot. We see immunosuppression and other effects that pushes them off their feed. We see estrogenic issues. We see immune issues with them. This has been a really horrible year with molds and mycotoxins and stuff in feed stuff. We want to have feed for the texture, the size of the feed needs to be appropriate. These birds like to have big chunky feed, even the little peeps. A lot of times we'll see feed refusal if it's powdery. A lot of times some feed manufacturers, will put all sorts of crap in food and floor sweepings and all of that sort of stuff. And a lot of times those things are powdery as well. And so one of the big mistakes that we see and feed refusal issues have to do with the texture of the food. The grit needs to be, you remember these things don't have teeth and they've got big gizzards that are grinding stuff. I didn't put the slides in between conventionally confinement reared birds and pasture reared birds, but the gizzards, they're almost double in size. The walls are much more muscular. They look like a totally different organ. And we need that sharp grit in there in order for them to grind. And it, they're not going to pick the stones up on the pasture and get that job done. Turkeys, I'll show you a slide with those guys. They'll eat their dressed weight in grit in the time it takes you to raise up a turkey. We see a huge difference in feed conversion. I had a farmer friend of mine. I don't know, he forgot to feed grit, or he put a little bit in and forgot. I don't know what was going on, but he wasn't feeding grit, and he heard me say that one day and decided, oh my gosh, I didn't, so I'm gonna. And he had a 35% improvement on his feed conversion rate just putting grit in. One of the other things that we see is that it seems to reduce the parasite burden. Parasites are not an issue, particularly in broilers, other than cocci. In laying birds, we do see some roundworm issues, and it can be pretty gross to open up a leg and see a little wormy flying in that egg. This is to remind you that 1 to 2 parts per million is little. 25 parts per million is little. This is a jar of sand that's calculated to have 1 million pieces of sand in it, and it just is a real. That's a half gallon, just a half gallon canning jar, and we know there's 1 million bits of sand in that, give or take a little bit. And you start to think about what's 1 part per million or even 25 parts per million look like. And it gets even more fun when we start looking at parts per billions. So there's a whole bunch of stuff about non-soy and soy feed and that sort of stuff, and I can talk quite a bit about that. But what we see is that it's possible to feed a non-soy feed. A lot of people want to not feed corn, they want to not feed soy for a variety of difference. But what we start seeing is that the feed cost is going to be up by about 35%. The birds will slow down growing. I've got some pretty nice studies that we did initially, probably 10 years ago when they first started doing non-soy foods, and we certainly have a lot of field data about that. So it's just something to think about when you're talking to your clients and farmers. What kind of feed are they feeding? Don't trust what folks are saying. Look at the feed label, but even more so, go and get that feed tested. They vary from batch to batch. A lot of times, depending on the mill, they may or may not have anything to do with what the feed label is. And a lot of times with the non-soy feeds, you need to really, really do a super protein adjustment. You typically need to replace that soy with 5 sources of protein. And a lot of times that protein will either get them to refuse feed because they just don't like the taste of it, or it'll start to flavor the eggs or the meat. I just want to show you some feeding kinds of things. The type of feed is important, but also the presentation of feed is important. And what we like to do is keep the rim of the feeder at the level of the average bird's back. So you can see these are Cornish cross broilers. Again, they look like they're just about getting ready to go on the hook. These feeders, they're covered. That keeps the birds out of the feeder. A lot of people don't cover them, and you can see at the end of that part that's underneath my control panel part, there's a round piece of plywood there that the piece they've cut off, that PVC pipe is poked up on the top of it. But that bottom rim needs to be up the level of their back. That helps with feeder space. If you look at those birds, if they're all hunkered down on the ground, they take 6 to 8 to 10, well, probably at that point, 10 to plus inches of bird space to go side by side on that feeder. If they're up a little higher, you can get more birds per linear inch of feeder. But the other thing that we find is it makes the feed and the water presented the way the bird wants to eat it. They want to scoop their heads, kind of like I'm thinking like a fish or a dragon or a chicken eating. They scoop that up. The other thing that we see is there's an incredibly less feed waste, and everything that we can do to keep feed off the ground is beneficial, because we start seeing interesting issues if these birds are eating off the ground. Problems with salmonella and botulism and other sorts of wet feed things. These again, these are PVC pipes cut with the tops off. These birds this is a laying flock. They're sex-linked red layers. These feeders are too close to the ground. This is a really super kind of feeder, but they should be suspended up off of the ground. That chicken that's in that big blue barrel is actually in an ash barrel, and they'll put ash out of coal furnaces or wood burning stoves or that sort of thing, and let them take dust baths, and they like it. It also helps with parasites. Some guys will throw a little bit of charcoal in there, and some guys will sometimes throw just a handful of flowers of sulfur in there as well. you know, they set those barrels down throughout the floor, and those hens will get in there. You can see she's dusty. You can it looks like it's shadow, but she's actually dusty up to just where her neck starts to go into her withers. Again, this is to remind me to, you know, you don't need to do anything fancy to feed turkeys grit. This stuff gets actually sold as landscaping stone, is what that's what it says in the boxes. And you can see how big those grit sizes are. It's quite remarkable how big grit these guys will take. And one of the things that we find is that undersized grit can be a real problem. There also seems to be that they have a preference for a white grit, a light grit, a gray grit. The commercial name is granite grit. They tend to like that better than the other common commercial name, which is a cherry stone grit. Cherry stone comes out of the Midwest. It tends to be smaller sized as well. So you have to look at some of the sizing charts. And if anybody's interested in that, send me an email. We can talk about it. This is to remind me of two things. This is a really nice setup for a feeder like that. It's actually to remind me of three things. And you can see how it's adjustable. You can scooch it up as these birds get higher. It all starts in the brooder. You know, what we do with these guys in the brooder is fundamentally important. It looks like there's a dead chick in the middle of that underneath the heat lamp. It's actually not. He's actually dust bathing in the peat moss. Peat moss bedding is a super bedding for these guys. It's dusty, but it isn't allergenic. The dust out of peat moss doesn't tend to tend to push allergic responses. That's why we use it a lot with horses that have COPD and that sort of stuff. It dries. It's got some natural antibacterial, antiseptic properties. It's a super, and it again, we've got some pretty nice studies on the cost of peat moss versus other bedding. Some people growl about, oh my God, it's you know, we're mining it and it not coming back and that sort of thing. That depends totally on the suppliers. And again, we can, you know, I've got some information about that. Again, starting in the brooder, one of the things when we learn to start troubleshooting, and we see it in both of these pictures, these birds are nicely spread out. We don't want to see birds huddled off in one corner or another or crunched up under the heat lamp. That thing to the right that you see that looks like a piece of roofing material is actually the top of what they call an Ohio brooder. They're a big, usually 4x4, sometimes 4x8, big panels, and we put lights in them, and the birdies can go up underneath them and stay warm, and they can scatter out through the floor. Again, you can see that these birds are nicely spread out. What we do with these birds in the first 24 hours when we get them in is fundamentally important. And again, I'm happy to go and talk more about that as we continue. And I'm happy to run this thing over to 2 webinars if people are really interested in chicken stuff. So one of the things that's really important to me when we start talking about how animals are raised, you know, everybody's down on confinement birds. So, you know, these are layers in a confinement, or broilers in a confinement system, and everybody's complaining, you know, look at them, they're all packed in, they're all mashed in, they're, you know, got no place to go, and blah blah blah. These are conventional birds on the floor. I just want to remind people that a lot of the organic production looks exactly like that. This is a certified organic group of chickens. The rules say that they have to have outdoor access, and somewhere in this house there's probably one at that end and one at this end, little places where those birds can go out. Realistically, when we look at how birds behave in a group, it's not a lot of square feet for bird, actually. And when we look at how birds behave in a group, and I'm wagging my fingers on this picture as we speak, but birds stay in little social pods, and they never go out, you know, of their quarter or eighth of that section of the floor. So they're not gonna shoulder their way past their sisters to get out that door. So only the big, you know, sort of the big brave alpha hens will go out those doors to go outside. But this is, you know, for everybody who's saying, oh yeah, like you know, organic chicken is better than conventional chicken. I'm here to tell you that that's not always the way that it is. There are some certified organic pastured bird people, and there are some not certified organic pastured bird people. But if you're thinking that, you know, some of the stuff that you see on the commercials is true, we're being deluded. What we're going to see in our practices is going to vary everything from Maisie the goose, who is this is a goose that my friend Jeff Maddox, who's one of the really good poultry advisors, Maisie was he built feed for this bird. You know, we're going to see backyard birds of all colors and kinds and shapes. A lot of the backyard birds are pets. We're going to see people who run. You know, this is a little eggmobile put in a busted up van at a farmer friend of mine's farm. Most of the smaller operations are going to have these kind of hoop type structures with cattle panels hooped up between some sort of a frame on the bottom, and these structures get moved the length of this frame every day. They'll get moved more frequently in muddy weather, wet weather, that sort of thing. You can see that they've got grit presented to them. You can see that these sides, some of them roll up and some of them don't. The red thing's a waterer, the silver thing's a feeder. For that group of birds, arguably they're a little bit low. You can see that white bucket hanging up in that upper left corner at about 10 o'clock. That's actually gravity fed down into that bell feeder, that plaston feeder. These is a larger unit. That unit's 20 by 40 feet. There's probably 600 birds in there. These are broilers, about a week to harvest, I would think, just looking at them. And those units, you can see the tractor out in front of it. Those units are pulled one length of the field every day. Again, further pulls, faster movement if it's raining and wet and sloppy. And you can see what those birds do with that just by, they're not necessarily eating everything there, but a lot of them are trampling on it and manuring on it and that sort of stuff. These units have portable waterers that go with them, and the feeders and everything tend to go with them. They have roll-up tarps on the side, and they close the ends in seasonally depending on what's going on. Again, that's just another view of that. Some of these have automatic waterers, like nipple tit waterers. Some of them use other types of waters. Those birds look like they're about 10 days to finish. This again is another pastured model with a little bit higher roof line. These look, as I'll tell you, you never see them look the same on a farm. So I just want to run you through some photographs just to show you the kinds of structures that we see. A lot of times there's cattle panel or some sort of page wire these things are made out of, but around the bottom they usually put some sort of chicken wire or something narrower gauge so the bad bandito predators don't come in and hook your chickens through the bottom. And again, same deal. And now that you'll know how to look at these, and you can see that these feeders are too low for these birds. There's arguably almost not enough feeder space for the feeder and water space for those birds as well. But you can see if you pick those things up, the 4 inches that they need to be picked up, you can see that because their birds are skinnier at their necks and skinnier when they're kind of stretching out instead of when they're blobbing down, you can get more birds around your stuff. This is a group of laying hens that have shelters that they can go into. They have nest laying boxes in those shelters, and that you can see they've got step-in electric fence around, and those birds would get moved every couple of days, depending on the pasture and stuff. And I can't remember. I think there's 900 birds or so in that group. The folks that I work with in pastured poultry, they raise anything from a couple thousand birds to 900,000, 1 million birds a year on pasture, moving every day. It's, don't have anybody tell you that this can't be done on scale. Again, looking again, this is more of a set stock kind of thing. They've got a much more fixed structure. That pole barn doesn't move at all. There's roofs and laying stuff in there, and the birds are given quite a large place to wander. You have to think a little bit about predation and those kinds of issues. When you're doing that, you don't want to be too close to a tree line. We use guardian animals in there, sometimes dogs, sometimes other species, sometimes geese. There's a variety of things to combat that. Some people say that the dark birds are not as susceptible to aerial predators because they're a little bit more camouflaged in with the grass. And you can see they've got roosts and laying areas in these fixed structures. I can give you lots of problems with those. Some people will take those out and divide that area around there into sort of 4 quadrants and rotate them through the 4 quadrants. There's a bunch of pasture management things. There's a group of turkeys on pasture in east central Pennsylvania. This was done. These pictures were taken October or so, late September, now into October. So they're a couple weeks from being on the hook, and they would have been in a brooder for 3 to 4 weeks and then put out on pasture as young poults. Again, these are just some photographs to show you quickly that you can see the water line that goes up, and then what you can't see is that heads towards 12 o'clock and does all of those waters, and you can see the sort of forage that these birds are in. We still have to feed them grain. They're monogastric creatures, and we balance their ration. For if they were just eating the grain only, and everything that they get off of the pasture is sort of gravy and extra on that. You can see how these feeders, again, they're almost at the right height, a little bit short, but you can see if you look carefully, they're suspended by chain up to the ridge lines, as are the waterers, and those whole, like they just go when they move that hoop. Tomorrow morning, everything just goes, and it doesn't take real long for those birds to get used to moving along with it. And again, just another. This is actually a converted greenhouse from a greenhouse manufacturer. It's on that same farm as those turkeys that were standing there. And just looking at that again. This is that hoop structure, putting out a little bit of scratch for those hens. This, interestingly, is at the same farm where the van chicken wagon was. But these are turkeys on pasture, and you can see behind where that's come up along, and the top rolls up to give them some airflow and to give them some exposure to light and that sort of stuff. One of the things that we see, and again, for you guys who know me, you know that I really love soil and I really love perennial agriculture. This is a photograph of a place in Arkansas or Texas, excuse me, that was cotton on cotton on cotton on cotton on cotton on cotton on cotton. And all that happened in this ground, basically the same piece of ground. All they did was run one of those big houses that hold 600 birds. They just ran it across once. They didn't go back. They didn't treat anything. They didn't do anything. They didn't mow. They didn't artificially fertilize. They didn't do anything. They just ran that. So top pictures where it started. This is after 1 year, and this is after 2 years of doing nothing other than running those birds across one time a season and leaving it. One of the things that we see when we talk about land management and stuff is that I don't know the story here. This is a photograph from a colleague of mine. The feeder is at the right height, but it's empty. And we don't want to see that, actually. But that also may explain why they've been so rough on the grass around there. That's really scratched off. I would suspect that these people are either not moving their house regularly enough, or they're not feeding their birds enough, and they're suffering under the fallacy that they're going to forage, by God, and they're going to eat that grass and those crickets and all of that sort of stuff. So we're not going to need to meet them any. We should always have a residue in the feeder. Always. You don't want to have it piled and piled and piled. You want them to mostly clean it up, but you want maybe 10-15% left in that feeder. Again, this is more common for a backyard pet laying kind of situation, and you can see why we run into some of the problems with those birds. It's a heavy parasite load. They tend to be all over the place with their lay, and they tend to really be hard on the ground. And you'll see, this is in a time of year you can judge by the rest of the foliage that, it's midsummer. It doesn't look, from the places further out, under the trees to the left, like they've had a lot of precipitation, but you can really see what significant damage those birds have done to that. And they're going to be on a try lot. And this is where troubleshooting, you get called to troubleshoot a lot of places, or you don't get called to troubleshoot, you get called to troubleshoot something else. And this is at a dairy, pretty well-run grass-based dairy. I was out visiting him for something or the other that didn't have a whole lot to do with the chickens. And he puts his chickens in 24, 48 hours, usually after his cattle come through. And I looked and I thought, what the ever-loving heck? These birds are just decimating this. I said to the guy, what the heck's going on? You got like wild chickens, you're forgetting to feed them. They've been out here for a month with no feed. What's going on? Oh, no, they just came out here. And he said, no, everything's good, everything's good, everything's good. I knew the guy who was mixing his feed. I suggested to him that maybe, he needed to get his feed checked because those birds were just tearing. I mean, they were foraging aggressively, and you shouldn't see all of those big spaces. I mean, those spaces were not there 24 hours before. So this went on for a little bit, and after a bit, the guy who mixes feed called me and said, hey Sue, I was up at so and so's farm the other day, and they had their feed tested, and he builds the formula. He doesn't mix the feed. And the guy who was actually mixing the feed had screwed something up, and they were super, super, super protein deficient. So they were like, digging for whatever they could find to try and balance their protein. As soon as they corrected the feed for these birds, they didn't do that. So you've got to, when you start working with these kind of situations, you just got to start to know about what's usual, what do you expect these birds to do. Even the aggressive foragers shouldn't be digging down. So we're going to do some troubleshooting stuff here for the next little bit. The poultry owner's troubleshooting pattern is, they find a chicken that's dead or dying or whatever, and they usually throw it in the compost pile. And then we start getting a whole lot more dead or dying, and sometimes they call somebody, and usually they check the internet, and then they throw them on the compost pile. And kind of around you go. So the joke is, the troubleshooting is shoot the birds and hope that the problem goes away. We'll just put them on the compost pile and that'll be the end of it. My bias, one of the only prescriptions that I ever write is to go and take your beer or your wine or your chocolate milk or your sandwich or whatever and go and sit with your livestock for a little bit, because they're going to tell you a lot. And we know this as homeopaths, right? I mean, this is the part that we know is we need to make observations on the larger environment, what's around, what are they eating, what are the rest of the birds doing. We need to make observations on the immediate environment as far as all the things that we talked about earlier, plus stuff that I probably haven't even talked about thinking. And then we've got to make observations for that individual chicken's environment. And again, the chicken, we look at them as the group, we look at them as a smaller group, and we look at them as the individual birds. Sometimes, I would not suggest this with a 6 or 8 bird pet backyard flock, but sometimes you can get a lot of information if you take 1 or 2 or 10 or a proportion of those birds, if you're troubleshooting, and sacrifice those birds for the betterment of the larger group, and actually take them in and look at them. You want to, anytime that you're submitting a bird for necropsy, whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're sending it to the path lab, you want to submit those birds alive if you can. You don't want to kill them and then send them. We know beak to tail, all the organ systems. We know, looking at live birds and looking at necropsying birds. The farmers, with the exception of the backyard folks, the farmers that I work with, all are, they all butcher their birds, or they have butchered birds, and they know what birds are supposed to look like or not supposed to look like. And even if they don't, I've done postmortems with farmers over the phone, where we gather and there's the bird, and I talk them through a postmortem, and it's actually possible to do and possible to get good diagnostic information, even if they're not going to follow stuff up with the lab. The advent of smartphones and sending pictures and zooming stuff around has really changed that game as well. We also need to remember that there's tests that we can do on live birds, and then there's tests that we can do on dead birds. But a 24-hour, 36-hour, God knows how long, hour bird out of the compost pile, or that's laying there because a lot of guys have day jobs as well as their farm jobs. If she's dead in the morning, I'll find her tonight when I get back, and that's not very helpful. One of the things that I'll encourage people is to not always. Dr. Google is foolish sometimes.
I can hear you.
And one of the things that we look at is sometimes the information.
Sorry about that, Suze. One of his. Anyway, you should be fine to go on. Dr. Beal.
You got me?
We do. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go back and see if we can get us back to where we want to be. So I just put these two slides out just because this is what a lot of people come, they're looking on the internet for information, and we've got stuff that just is labeled totally wrong. And so we've got liver labeled as lungs and God knows what else. So we just have to recognize that, Dr. Google might have skipped class. The other thing that we need to think about is sometimes we see stuff that's common, but it's not normal. And this is the lining of a gizzard in a bird that has been fed not GMO food. And this lining is really thick and really luxurious and doesn't have holes in it and doesn't have ulcers in it. And if the only kind of gizzard lining you've ever seen is a conventionally raised bird, you wouldn't know whether this was hypertrophied or discolored or what. But this is really much more normal gizzard lining than you'd ever see. And again, if you've never seen this stuff and you start to play with this, it's just something to keep in the that keeps in the back of your mind. Oh my gosh, the dancing things are here. So you guys can see those pictures on the side. I don't have bigger ones, or else I would have put them in. We see curly toe from a riboflavin deficiency, absolute riboflavin deficiency, and you'll see those birds look exactly like they look. They got those little squinched up toes. Manganese deficiency, we see the splattle egg with them. They slip the tendon in their joints, and they literally go down like that. Jeff Maddox laughs at me because I'll correct the deficiencies. I'll treat them with remedy, usually, but not always, in one of the calcareas, and I'll actually adjust them. And that doesn't always work in a big flock. If you've got 10,000 birds on the floor or 800 birds in one of those big hoops, but we've done it. And we sometimes see calcium deficiency as well. Rickets, same. That's just the way it looks. It's the same as we see in all species. A lot of times we will treat these guys with milk, clabbered milk, yogurt, those sorts of things. Some of the farmers will actually feed milk all the time. They'll mix their mash up, or they'll put some milk in the bottom of the feed and feed that kind of. Some of them will clabber it or ferment it. Some of them will feed yogurt. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with doing that, although sometimes it's not cost effective. And if we do that, we've removed milk from our list of treatments. And I'm here to tell you, raw milk or yogurt is a really, really, really common treatment for things that ail poultry. So I would encourage you not to do that. We also see things like necrotic enteritis and cocci. There's too many. We usually see it with the Clostridium. It's increasingly an issue with the push towards the Clostridia perfringens, or the other clostridial species, with the use of contaminated feed with the glyphosate in it. We see cocci pretty commonly. It tends to be pretty commonly in a not well managed situation. It tends to be a management issue, and they're eating off the ground, or there's manure in their water. that sort of thing. So we use raw milk with them, put it out there, literally let them drink it out of a pie plate on the floor. We eliminate the contributing factors. I don't use copper sulfate very often. A lot of my colleagues will do that, but I tend not to. We try it and repair what's going on with the bedding. Sometimes we can help with liming the yard. I'll tell you here in the next couple slides why I don't use copper sulfate very often. And it's because, you start thinking like a homeopath when you are a homeopath, and you start saying, okay, well, what kind of manure are we looking? Can we land a remedy based on what we're seeing with the manure and what we're seeing with the kind of behavior on the birds? Are they off their food? Are they off their drinking? Are they chilly? Are they restless? My experience is most of the time, those coxy cases, usually they'll clean up with some milk and some probiotics and prebiotics. If I actually need to treat, usually they end up in mercurius cases, arsenicum cases, sometimes phosphorus cases, but not as often in my experience. More commonly arsenicum or mercurius type kinds of cases. It's very common for folks to send you pictures of poop and those sorts of things. This actually is a picture of not as much manure, but sloughed intestinal lining. And so the kinds of remedies that we would use in parvo, flapping my hands in the air with the diagnostic label, with the kinds of typhus-like diseases that get labeled as parvo. A lot of times those types of remedies work really well with these necrotic enteritis cases, but you'll see them slough their whole intestinal lining. You'll see lots of mucus, lots of blood. Remember that chickens don't pee, right? They put their urate port in with their manure as well. So sometimes if we have, this is a high urate manure, right? So this is actually when we start crossing the species with repertorization, we're seeing actually two things with this. We're seeing loose part of the poop part of the manure, and we're seeing a high urate manure, which would be the same. So I repertorize that as urine increase, and it's the best I know how to do with that. But we need to recognize that for that, what that is. That is not what people will get tricked and start to tell you is that is that's stool discolored white. It's not. It's actually urates. It's the urine part. Oh my gosh, here we go, other common illnesses. So I've got some photographs of this. We see ascites a lot. We see it's a lot of, it's dropsy in the abdomen. We'll see it usually in birds that are finishing late. They're almost ready to slaughter. Somebody will call you up, they got 600 birds and they're starting to die. And it tends to be at that end of things, it tends to be a big salvage thing. The dropsy remedies may or may not kind of get you through a little bit. But more often it's keeping the birds cool, it's keeping them calm, it's backing off on their feed, and it's getting them dead as soon as you can rather than letting them die. The thing that's really interesting about ascites in birds, though, is that it goes back. It's worse if we've got low oxygen tension, so at altitudes. It's worse if you've got big ammonias and those sorts of things. But one of the things that you have to understand about ascites is that it may be happening when that bird's 6, 7, 8 weeks old, but it happened because that bird got chilled, often in the brooder. So that may have set the stage for things at 3, 5, maybe even 7 days of age when that bird got some sort of a chill shock. And I really encourage folks when they see that happening, not to just correct the warm them up, certainly, but realize that down the road you've set this bird up for ascites. And I try and get guys. Aconite seems to be a really great remedy for these birds that get children in the brooder. And they may or may not have a lot of other symptoms. I treated probably 1,800 birds or so January, down in Texas, they treated him in the water with aconite because we'd had big front come through. It was 22 degrees. It was, these birds aren't used to seeing that kind of weather, and they looked pretty stressed out, and it really made a difference with them within 24 hours. We see coryza, infectious coryza. It's a big blanket statement of anything that's kind of a cold. We know coryza as the language of our discipline. So we'll see, they'll sneeze, they'll get watery eyes, their wattles may get swollen up. The notes here say it's a bacterial infection, but it is actually a susceptibility kind of thing. I tend to find, again, I don't treat that with remedy very often. Usually I'll correct whatever the underlying stuff is, and I tend to treat that with fairly high doses of vitamin E and sometimes some garlic in the water. And oftentimes that's all it takes. If it isn't, then I go through the coryza remedies. I've got some slides to show you why I can't tell you here, this is the magic remedy to use. This is a bird that's died of ascites. The discoloration is because the bird's been down. The lack of feather is because he's been down on his chest and he's rubbed his feathers off. You can see the feather tracks. They don't have feathers across every inch of their body. But you can see how swollen that bottom of his abdomen is. He's kind of upside down. That slide, in my opinion, needs to be turned around. So 12 o'clock's at 6 o'clock, and here's his vent at 12 o'clock, and his legs are going up to the sky, and there's all of that dropsy and fluid in his abdomen. And you can see just as you open that abdomen, now this is a pretty extreme case, but they see that straw colored ascites fluid in there. Sometimes you'll just see a relatively small amount of it, but you need to remember that any of that kind of fluid in an abdomen in a bird is not normal. Viral arthritis, we see it's traditionally a mycoplasma infection. They say viral in this slide, and I didn't change it. We'll see those birds down a lot of times on their hocks or just sitting in their butts, and we see that really sort of erosive, hemorrhagic kind of area. I've actually treated these birds with mercurius. This is what they tend to look like. They sit down on their hocks. A lot of times you'll see some edema or joint effusion, that sort of thing. I get some calls about this. Some people feel that once it's the party line is once it's in your flock, and that's not a good thing. I've had some interesting time. I've had a couple of situations where I've treated with mercurius, and these birds have gone. They tend to, what they do is they just take them to slaughter, and they end up tanking the affected parts. So this is why my segue to eye stuff is mycoplasma is also one of the causative agents, if you believe in the germ theory of disease, that we see in some of these eye things. And you remember these guys have sinus sacs around their eyes. For those of you who don't remember, that big thing that looks like a donut is that bird's ear. And you can see with his nares, his quanae, that come up through the top of the mouth and out into the nares. And we see all sorts of variations on the theme of this. And what I tend to do with these birds is that I tend to use that face swelling. I may use some sinus rubrics, but what I tend to do is look and see, do we have a modality? First of all, it's really important in my experience with birds, if we can get some sort of a modality there, and then do the characterization of the discharge. And so you can see, it varies from this, a turkey poult. It varies from this sort of, sinus redness and things. Sometimes the eyes are crusty, sometimes they're wide open, sometimes the birds look bright and happy, they just got this old swollen face. Other times they look like they're not happy. Some of the birds are really sensitive to touch, some of the birds are not sensitive to touch. You can see again this swelling that we see. Some of these birds actually have some nasal discharge, some of them don't. Again, this is quite extreme. You can see this bird, looks more of a you know, I mean, the remedies that come to mind, you guys know them, you know, yellow discharges and swelling and respiratory kinds of things. And, you know, sometimes I'll take a swing at them. Um, Sometimes when you first start working with chicken people, they don't tend to be very good about, you know, are they eating or drinking or behaviors or, you know, activities. Once you start working with them a little bit, it's a whole lot easier. You know, they'll tell you that they're off their water. The confinement guys, they'll tell you they're off their water because they know exactly how much water those birds drink every day, and they'll know if their water meters are down. So it's really ironic. Sometimes you can get some more information from the confinement guys. The other thing is to just be careful, because sometimes you get a lot of stuff like, you know, you've got a swollen eye, and so do you have a wound, an injury? Do you have like a papilloma? That sort of stuff. It's not necessarily always a sinus thing. So just, you know, don't be tricked. And if it's not making sense, um, if it's not making sense, you know, get a photograph if you can, or if you can't see, you know, if you can't see the bird. The other thing that I always do with these guys, and you would be just amazed at how many times, you know, some vitamin E in a bird will make a difference. And, you know, I joke that it can be almost the cure-all, which tells me that a lot of these diseases are management diseases rather than naturally occurring chronic disease. But a lot of these times we'll use some vitamin E in these birds, and stuff starts to abate fairly quickly. About 50 to 100 units a bird. You're not going to overdose them in the 3 to 5 to 7 or so days that you're going to treat them. We'll float it up on the water so they get it, or we'll actually mix it up in some water and mix it in a small amount of feed to feed them. There are a couple of places that make a water soluble vitamin E. The Furtrall company actually carries one that's really super. But as a bird, one of the other things that you want to ask people when, you know, they've been having dead birds that they've been putting in the compost or whatever is how was the bird when you found him? You know, was he laying over on his side? Was he laying on his back? Did he die at night? Did he die in the morning? Those kinds of things. This is what we commonly call a flip over. It's a heart attack type bird, and will you know, that they always look like that, flipped over on the back, just clumper. This is an interesting photograph. I have some other ones. This is something that I have not had the opportunity to treat, but it oftentimes people will call and get all grossed out. You see that sort of necrotic. Sometimes it looks hemorrhagic like that. Sometimes it actually looks green, like olive green color. That's the tender of a chicken breast in a double-breasted bird. You can see that breast has been opened like a book from end to end, and winged open, and that's that we'll see. They call it green muscle disease, and we see it when birds flap, and whether they're fresh and red or just kind of hard, or whether they're dark green, depends on how long ago did they flap between when they flapped and when we killed them. And so this bird flapped relatively close to when it was being killed. Other birds that we see that have that tighter green in them, they would flap earlier, you know, and so that bruising and compartment syndrome gets much more mature. I haven't ever had the opportunity to treat these because you can't see them till they're dead, actually, this way. I think it would be really interesting. I think it would be really interesting to treat them with arnica, you know, if we have that situation. They'll flap because of handling. They'll flap, you know, when you're catching them, if you're not catching them quietly and calmly. They'll flap if there's predators. Rats in the pen at night are a really common reason to get them flapping. So there's a bunch of reasons. I usually can't get guys to tell me that their birds, you know, that, oh my God, we had a big flapping episode. So this is all theoretical and philosophical, but I would be very curious to see what would happen if we treated them close to the flapping episode with some high potency arnica. These are some septicemia things you guys remember from all your bird stuff way back in the day when you were doing bird stuff. And for those of you who still do bird stuff, is that these guys tend to make that, you know, that thick insupposited pus, purulent discharge stuff. And so it's one of the things that I'm not sure whether we can be that accurate in using that as a rare and unusual symptom. I tend to think, and what I tend to do clinically is if we have any other kind of purulent exudate that isn't that thick, caseous kind of stuff, I'll use that. But other words, I don't find, ask me in 20 years, I don't know, but I think that that's species usual, and so I don't see that it's such a unique symptom. Again, this is a liver from one of those septicemia birds. You can see that sort of shotgunny appearance of the septic process. This is a bird that you would look at really quickly and you think, oh my gosh, that looks like it's got all of this purulent exudate in the omental folds and stuff. But really what this is an old Buff Orpington layer. They're a really great triple purpose type bird, dual purpose type bird. A big kind of round. They're kind of like the boxy Labrador retrievers of Chickenland, and this is a more of a pet bird than a production bird, and they fed her too well, and that's just all sort of fat in the omentum because she's quite obese. This is a bird with aspergillosis. You can see those necrotic or little purulent exudate things, and that was because of fungal contamination in the bird's environment. One of the most favorite things for people to do is tell us that every dead turkey they see has got blackhead, and that is certainly not the truth. But we see a lot of people that say, oh, if they've got lesions on their heads and they're dead or any combination of that, a lot of growers think that they're dealing with blackhead. I've just got a bunch of pictures of fowl pox to show you. It looks basically the same in a lot of different species. It tends to be more obvious in turkeys than it is in poultry. The problem with fowl pox in turkeys, it usually doesn't kill them. Sometimes we'll see a wet variety that makes their mouths really excoriated and gets them sort of in almost a mercurius-like state, ulcerated and excoriated. And it'll slow their growth down, certainly, but oftentimes it doesn't kill them. The problem is if you're running two different groups of birds and you have laying hens, if laying hens get exposed to this, they forget to lay eggs for the rest of their lives, and you end up with a great need to make chicken soup quickly. It can be quite a problem. So you can see there's variations and combinations of what it looks like. This is a flock. Some of you have heard me tell this story. This is a flock that we actually treated in Illinois, Iowa, with no-sode, and the only time fowl pox kills a bird, as you can see if you look at the very far right of that slide, is if the farmer panics and lops its head off. But we took the exudate from those lesions, and we took actually a little bit of blood, and the owner is really kind of an anal retentive, fascinatingly fun physician actually, and she actually made a no-sode out of the remedy. She didn't have any pellets to put it on, so we just did it out of the solution, and she treated her birds. The turkeys that didn't have clinical symptoms never got clinical symptoms. The turkeys that did have clinical symptoms cleaned up a whole lot faster, and none of her laying hens missed an egg. So we were really happy with that. She ran it up to 30C. She ran it with blood, and she ran it with exudate as well. This is what a liver looks like in a bird that actually has blackhead, and they've got these rather telling pathognomonic bullseye kinds of lesions. And for folks who are interested in blackhead in birds, I did a review article for the APA newsletter last year or the year before. One of the interesting things about that particular situation, it takes an intermediate host and that sort of thing. But one of the things that they're finding is that it not getting blackhead is really dependent on having healthy, natural, normal flora. And if those birds have that, the chances of them getting blackhead is reduced. This is pretty simple. I kind of tagged on my I use a lot of vinegar in these birds. I use a lot of whole milk products, ideally raw if you can get it. If not, whole, best quality whole milk you can get. Raw would be my choice. Organic would be my next choice. Well, grass-fed would probably be my next choice. Organic would be my third choice. Use a lot of garlic oil. I don't use the oil as much as a tincture or with it in water. I'll just smash a couple of cloves of garlic and put it in a quart of water and let it marinate for eight hours or so and get all of those newly active medicinal herbal things. A lot of probiotics, direct fed microbials. I put copper sulfate on that list just because some folks use it commonly and some farmers use it commonly. It's not something I tend to reach for. I tend to, if the vitamin E is a big one as well. And if those things, if I don't see stuff turning around, then I'll come in and do the homeopathic remedies. This is to remind me to tell you again that eggs can be really helpful. And if you've got birds that you think are not being born with a really robust immune function, or that they might need some specific kick in the butt for the environment that they're in, if you've got eggs from an older group of birds, you can feed those back to the young birds. I haven't seen that it's been an issue with them. Oh my gosh, we're going to want to start to eat eggs, because you don't feed them in the shell. You take them out and you just crumble them on top of or pour them on top. Interestingly, and I can't totally explain this, I know what we see clinically. A lot of times those eggs will get fed, cooked, which you would think would be more destructive of the antibody potential, but we actually have quite a few flocks where we've been feeding eggs to the peeps and not seeing the kind of disease issues that we're seeing in those flocks. So I'm not quite sure about that. We certainly know historically, anybody who's been in any kind of large animal practice for a while, we know the value of feeding, eggs and raw eggs from birds on the farm, to calves with diarrhea and that sort of stuff. Here's a couple wormer recipes. I'm happy to send them out. Some of you have seen these before. This is a general wormer recipe that I use to bolus into ruminants. I've got some nice studies that some are actually done at a real university and some are field studies about using that wormer with the cayenne, garlic, and diatomaceous earth by volume, not by weight. It's hot, and so you want to paste it. You want to put it in a bolus, or you want to paste it far back. The birds will actually, you can put that into the birds. This particular recipe tends to work better in my hands with a smaller group of birds. If I've got a larger group of birds, this is what I'll use if we're worming. I have not had the opportunity to treat a lot of birds, looking at the rectum worms rubrics, although I have had some birds that we've treated the flock and they ended up not getting, these are laying flocks, and they ended up not getting worms at a time when flocks that they've had in the past have had worms. So I don't know what to tell you there either. Ask me in 20 years. These are some flow charts, and again, I can get those to you. They're just really helpful for coming down, and there's some additional things. I'm actually working on some more written material on treating poultry naturally, amending some old books that I found and some stuff that was written 10 or 12, 15 years ago now. So some of the treatments in here I would change a little bit or add some different homeopathic stuff, but I'm going to just show them to you just because they're simple and pretty they're pretty interesting to look at. These are written for farmers, specifically for farmers. We could write them in super duper veterinary language. I don't mean to insult anybody, and I didn't correct the spelling of botulism there because I couldn't on that slide. And then we start looking at the different leg problems and those kinds of things that we see with these guys. So that's the fast overview of poultry for anybody who's interested in birds at all. Again, it was the overview of a lot of the production ends of things rather than, oh my goodness, it's broken, what's the remedy that we use to fix it. But I am really here to tell you there's a lot of farmers out there who are raising pasture poultry who would be really, really happy to have somebody who would be interested in troubleshooting or helping them troubleshoot, or if needing access to remedy, or somebody with a sympathetic ear who's interested in treating these birds in a more natural way. We know that the regulatory issues, both in the States and in Canada, about using antibiotics in therapeutic ways has really changed a lot. The face of both the poultry and the cattle industry too, but certainly the confinement poultry and hog industry. And those guys are really interested in talking about some of the homeopathic and herbal specifics, and also some of the other nutritional specifics. So it's really changed. It's really changed. I think it's changed the landscape. The other way it's changed the landscape is those guys are doing a lot of really interesting research that a lot of us have not been able to do before. I don't usually make a point of slaughtering chickens in the timber in the middle of the winter. That was a friend of mine's flock whose landlord was in the process of evicting her, and she wanted to get her chickens killed. And for people who are also interested in pasture poultry stuff, Jeff Maddox, who's the head of the nutritional team at Fertrell, has a really super book called Pastured Poultry Feeding and Management. He's had 3 editions of it out. The most recent edition has got a picture of him holding a red laying hen on the cover. The second edition's got a turkey on it, and I forget what the first edition's got on it. I think a turkey as well. So it's pretty easy to find online if people are interested in ordering it. You can order it directly from the Fertrell company, or you can find it online. And I know we've gone a little bit over, but if anybody has any specific questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them. And thanks for your attention.
Wow, that was awesome, Sue. Thanks so much. No questions from any attendees that I can see. Anyone else have any other comments that they want to make?
And I have a question.
Yep.
So I know that was a zooming fast overview. Are there people who would be more interested in down the road doing another poultry webinar looking at more specifically how do we repertorize those kinds of situations, or more specifically, here we've got this clinical picture or diagnostic label? And you don't have to answer that right now. It would be easy to stick your hand up if you want to, or send Jeff an email or something, because we're happy to do a more specific webinar down the road.
I know. I would be very interested. Keelan, you're unmuted. Do you have a comment or question?
Oh, no, I would just like to, I'd be interested in the chickens. And I was wondering too, do you ever see bumblefoot or not as much?
Yeah, I do. Less so on, we'll tend to see it in pasture birds if they're on, if it's really dry, or if they're putting them onto mowed stuff or stuff that's been grazed down really short by other species, and then they're putting the birds on afterwards. I'll see it in pet, like I say pet chickens, backyard chickens, 3 to 6 to 9 laying hens in the backyard. I'll see it in there, and usually that's more of the conventional kinds of things that you see bumblefoot in. They get trauma. They're on a dirt lot. They don't have proper roosting. They may be, a lot of those houses that they make have got slats on the floors that are not the rubberized, the wide slats, and they're up on wire and that sort of thing. I tend to use the correct why they're doing that. So if they're going on to rough stubble and that sort of stuff, they need to amend their grazing program a little bit, or their mowing program. I tend to use topical stuff. Sometimes I'll use a calendula tincture or hypercalcium on that, and then I tend to use the abscess remedies. And I don't necessarily just use like foot abscess. I'll use general abscess. Some of these birds are really painful. Some of them aren't. So we can differentiate things like silica or hepar or that sort of stuff. Sometimes calendula internally, impotency.
Okay, awesome. So myself, Keelan, any other, Henrietta, Jane, Judy, we were not able to raise our hands, but any comments or things from you guys? Nope. Okay. So anything else, Dr. Beal?
Nothing. I don't know what this
Oh.
Dr. Beale thing is.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We really appreciate all your time, and we will see you next month. And thank you again.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Bye bye.